Now this is one of the easiest, fastest leveling chain lightning build for the sorcerer. With this build you can easily speed through dungeons while doing high damage and leveling up the quickest. This build does not require any certain items or any legendary aspects. This build is also really fun to use, and I highly recommend to check it out in the earlier levels when respecting is really cheap. So let's check this out. Okay, so first I'm going to show you clearing this dungeon, and you can easily do dungeons 5 to 10 levels higher than you. Now I can just easily equip the Barber Wrathful Malignant Heart and do dungeons that are 20 levels higher than myself with this build. But the Barber Wrathful Malignant Heart is rare, and not everyone is going to have it. I wanted to share a build where you don't need this item for this build to work. This chain lightning build is really strong and very easy to use. Now I'm currently leveling up my sorcerer, so this build is ideally designed for leveling from 1 to 70. Now once you get ancestral level gear, then that's when you want to make adjustments to this build to make it more optimized. In the early levels, you're not going to have a lot of cooldown reduction, mana regeneration, high attack speed, and so on. And you're always going to change up your gear for better gear when leveling. So I'll explain some skills to change around once you get better gear, but I'll have an updated guide once I level up higher and equip ancestral level gear. Now with this build, you do not need any specific gear or legendary aspects for this build to work, but having legendary aspects will definitely make this build stronger. So with this build, I focus on speed, ease of use, able to use any gear, and optimizing the leveling experience. Okay, so let's check out the skills. Now the basic skill I'm using is Spark, and this will be one of the best basic skills in the early leveling phases. The reason why is that this skill is ranged. Having a ranged basic skill is good because in the early levels, you're not going to have a lot of defense, so attacking from range is safer. And there are also a lot of ranged enemies and enemies that also run away from you. So having a ranged attack will easily handle those enemies. And there are also some enemies and bosses that shoot an AoE around them, and if you step in that AoE, you'll take damage. So having a ranged attack will make it very easy to handle those enemies as well. And also in the early levels, you're not going to have a lot of resource regeneration and cooldown reduction, so you're going to use your basic skill more in the early levels. The next skill I'm using is Chain Lightning, and this will be our main damage dealing skill. This skill will shred bosses and clear a lot of enemies. Now the ultimate skill I'm using is Unstable Currents, and this will just make clearing elites and destroying bosses faster. The next skill I have Frost Nova, and this will freeze and apply vulnerable to enemies. And for the next skill I have Ice Armor for defense, and for the last skill I have Teleport for movement and breaking out of crowd control effects. Okay, so now let's check out the enchantments. Now the first enchantment slot you will unlock at level 15, and the enchantment I chose is Firebolt. And Firebolt will give all our skills burning damage, so our lightning skills and our ice skills can now apply burning damage. Now because all our skills apply burning damage, we can benefit from this skill, Devouring Blaze, which will greatly increase our critical strike damage. The next enchantment slot you'll unlock at level 30, and the skill I chose to enchant is Frostbolt. And this skill will give all our skills the ability to apply chill. And applying chill to enemies also has a chance to freeze the enemies as well, and having chilled or frozen enemies will benefit from this skill, Horror Frost, which will greatly increase our damage. So these are the two enchantments I chose. So before you put skill points into Devouring Blaze or Horror Frost, make sure you have these two enchantments equipped, or you're just wasting your skill points. Now there are other enchantments that are worth considering in comparison to the ones I'm using. For instance, the Frozen Orb enchantment or Ball Lightning enchantment can be more effective when you have improved gear and stats, but during the initial levels, it's not the best idea to go for these enchantments because you'll notice that their effects won't activate as frequently. This is because you won't have the suitable gear or stats early on, given that you'll be frequently swapping out your equipment for better options when leveling. Okay, so next let's check out the skill tree. Now I do want to mention that there are some skills that you want to take earlier than later, and I'll highlight those skills when going over this skill tree. So starting with the basic skills, I put 1 point into Firebolt and 1 point into Frostbolt, and these skills are used for the enchantment slots. Now the first enchantment slot is unlocked at level 15, so I'll put 1 point into Firebolt at level 15, and the second enchantment slot is unlocked at level 30, so put 1 point into Frostbolt at level 30. And the basic skill I'm using is Spark, so I put 5 points into Spark, a point into Enhanced Spark, and a point into Glinting Spark. And of course, Spark is one of the best and easiest basic skills to use in the early leveling phases. Now I do want to mention that once you get good gear, as in you have good defense, good cooldown reduction, and good resource regeneration, then I would switch out Spark to Arc Lash. The reason why is that in the later levels, damage will be more important, and Arc Lash just does more damage compared to Spark. But in the earlier levels, I highly recommend to use Spark instead, because this skill is ranged, making it easier to hit enemies. Next, for the core skills, I put 5 points into Chain Lightning, a point into enhanced chain lightning, and a point into greater chain lightning. And of course, chain lightning is our main damage dealing skill, and this skill will destroy bosses. I put 1 point into devastation and 3 points into elemental dominance, and this will increase our core skills damage. Next, for the defensive skills, I put 1 point into teleport, 1 point into enhanced teleport, and a point into shimmering teleport. And this is just one of the best movement skills in the game. Next, I put 1 point into ice armor, a point into enhanced ice armor, and a point into shimmering ice armor. And this skill is good for survivability. Next, I put 1 point into frost nova, a point into enhanced frost nova, and a point into mystical frost nova. And this skill will freeze and apply vulnerable to enemies. I put 1 point into elemental attunement to have a chance to reset one of our defensive skills for free, and 3 points into glass cannon for increased damage. Now next, for the conjuration skills, I put 1 point into align the elements, 2 points into mana shield, and 2 points into protection. And these skills is just to increase our survivability, but I recommend getting these skills last just because the other skills are more beneficial. Next, for the mastery skills, I put 1 point into inner flames and 3 points into devouring blaze, and this skill will greatly increase our critical strike damage. Now just be aware, only put points into devouring blaze once you have the firebolt enchantment equipped at level 15, because this skill requires your skills to do burning damage in order for this skill to take effect. So you'll be wasting your skill points here if you don't have this firebolt enchantment equipped. Okay, so next, for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into unstable currents and a point into prime unstable currents, and this ultimate skill will pretty much destroy anything, groups of enemies or bosses. The one downside for this ultimate skill is that the cooldown is so long. Next, I put 3 points into coursing currents, which will increase our critical strike chance, and 3 points into conduction, which will increase our movement speed. I put 3 points into fiery surge, and this will increase our mana regeneration, but the firebolt enchantment is required for that skill to take effect. And next, I put 1 point into permafrost and 3 points into hoarfrost, and this will increase our damage to chilled enemies. So basically, in order to have this skill take effect, you'll need the frostbolt enchantment equipped. So make sure you get the hoarfrost skill when you have the ability to equip the frostbolt enchantment. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into virus mastery, and this will increase our shock skill damage while taking less damage from close enemies. And that's pretty much the full skill tree, but depending on the stats and gear you have, you can switch some skills around to fit your playstyle. Okay, so next let's check out the gear. Now when it comes to leveling, you really just want to look for the plus green number and equip the higher number. And once you reach ancestral level gear, that's basically when you want to look at your stats and choose the best stats possible for that gear. So since I'm still leveling, I'm looking out for the plus green number. Now I'm just going to go over some important items and legendary aspects, but I'll have the full build in a D4 build planner in the description below. And I do want to mention that I got all the legendary aspects from the Codex of Power, so you should be able to easily get all the legendary aspects I have equipped. But I do want to mention that this build is strong in the early levels without the need of any specific gear or any particular legendary aspect. So I'm just going to highlight some stats and legendary aspects that will make this build better. So on the amulet, now ideally you're looking for movement speed, because having movement speed just makes leveling a lot faster. And the legendary aspect I have is that chain lightning has a 53% chance to chain 4 additional times. This will just greatly increase our chain lightning damage. For the ring, the legendary aspect I have is that each time chain lightning bounces, gain 1.5 mana, and this legendary aspect will help us regain mana quicker so we can spam more chain lightnings. And for the next ring legendary aspect I have, using cooldown restores 15 mana, and since we have a lot of cooldown skills, this will help us regenerate mana quicker. And for the legendary aspect for my weapon, I have you deal 25% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies, and this will just greatly increase our damage when we frost nova enemies. And for the offhand, the legendary aspect I have, basic skills gain 15% attack speed, and this will just greatly increase our basic attack speed. Now for the boots, you're looking for movement speed. Having high movement speed will increase your leveling speed. And the legendary aspect I have is becoming injured while crowd control grants you unstoppable for 4 seconds. Now this legendary aspect has saved me a couple times when you get constantly chained into crowd control effects. Now for the pants, the legendary aspect I have is you gain 0.25% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 15%. And this legendary aspect is just one of the best for survivability. Now for the next piece of equipment, like my helmet, the chest piece, and the gloves, these legendary aspects you can switch around depending on what legendary aspects you like. All these legendary aspects I got from the Power of Codex, and I didn't have to hunt any of these legendary aspects down. Okay, so that's pretty much the gear for this build, and like I mentioned before, I'll have a D4 build planner in the description below with the ideal stats and the legendary aspects you're looking for. Now for the gems and malignant hearts, you can switch these around depending on what you have, because this build does not require any specific items. But for the armor, you're looking for ruby gems for increased maximum life, sapphire gems for the weapon for increased critical strike chance to crowd control enemies, and for the malignant hearts, the Pakana heart for increased damage, and the revenge heart to reflect damage. Now the barber wrathful malignant heart is just the best malignant heart in the game, but this malignant heart is rare, so if you have it, definitely use it, because this malignant heart can make any build into an overpowered build. But like I mentioned before, this build does not require any specific items for this build to work. Now for the Paragon board, and since I'm still leveling, this Paragon board is not fully loaded out. This is the layout I have so far. So on the starting board, I put the exploit glyph for increased vulnerable damage. Then I headed up this way, and on the next Paragon board, I took Frigid Fate to get the increased vulnerable damage from the rare nodes. Now once I'm higher level and have more Paragon points, I will have an updated video on this build with a complete Paragon board, so stay tuned. Alright, so thanks for checking out one of the best, fastest, early level chain lightning build for the Sorcerer. Now this build is really strong in the early levels without the need of any specific gear or stats. But once you get into endgame and start getting endgame gear, then that's when you want to start optimizing your skills depending on the stats and gear you have. Now I will have an updated build guide once I'm higher level and have endgame gear, and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,